Well, this is the fourth of our sermon series, Understanding the Bible, the historical narratives. And as with the other ones I've done, I have put some notes, and they're on the table at the back. You don't need them now, but if you want to sort of, have a look afterwards, it will just sort of roughly show you where we've gone. I'll just put these down. So God makes this covenant with Abraham and his descendants. They turn into a great nation. God releases them from slavery and they go into the desert. Last week, Karen talked about the law in the desert. They're given the law. And the law is sort of the small print of the deal that they've made with God. Their side of this sacred bargain. And their side is to live not just to please themselves, but live in a way which is pleasing to God. And that's described in the law. And then they come out into the promised land. And this is an incredible moment, They are God's people. God's never had a people before. God's own nation, a holy people who are going to live in a holy way, who God is going to bless, and who's going to bless God in this wonderful land that they've been given. And it all goes tragically wrong. And that's what you need to know about the historical narratives, this last section of their history. So we're dealing with the book of Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, all their time in the Holy Land. And it ends in tragedy, with them being dragged off and going back into slavery, because they cannot keep their side of this covenant, of this bargain. And you might think, well, how far did they get? The answer is they didn't get very far indeed. If you just look at the first commandment of the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God, and you will have no other gods before me. They didn't actually manage that one at any point in their history. And I'm not here to either condemn the people of Israel at that time or to make excuses for them. They just seemed to find it impossible to resist. The promised land, of course, was full of people who had shrines to their own gods, all these gods of fertility, Baal and Asherah and Moloch and many, many others. And there was never a time when Israel wasn't leading a double life. Worshipping the one true God, Yahweh, on one hand, and then secretly indulging in all this pagan religion as well. And it wasn't very pleasant stuff, because a lot involved human sacrifice and ritual prostitution. It was not even secret that often. So when we read about Gideon, in the book of Judges, Gideon is called to rise up against the Midianites who are oppressing the people of Israel. And the first thing he's called to do is to smash down the altar of Baal. Now, where is the altar of Baal? Do you think it's in the Midianites' territory? No, it's not. It's there for the Israelites to worship Baal. Is it sort of secretly tucked in away? No. It's in the middle of town. Actually, it's in Gideon's front garden. So what he does at night, because he's so scared of the people of Israel, is he goes out into his own garden and he smashes his own altar to Baal. And the next day, the people are furious and they come to his father and say, "Give us Gideon, we have to kill him because he's stopped us worshipping Baal." These are the people of Israel. So you get the problem. The first commandment, you will have no other gods but me. You will not build images and poles and altars and bow down before them. It's exactly what they were doing. Now, I've mentioned this period of the Judges. For the first few hundred years in the Promised Land, Israel didn't have kings. In fact, each tribe, each clan governed itself, and it seemed to work pretty well. They only need judges when there was a dispute between clans or a dispute between tribes, and the judges weren't sort of self-appointed. The judges were people who had the agreement of everyone, of all the tribes and clans, that they were someone of such integrity and wisdom, of such upstandingness, that all sides would agree to whatever their judgment was about the issue. And so these people were hugely important. They weren't paid for it, but they're very, very high social status. They weren't always men. I mean, Deborah famously was one of the judges. And they didn't just judge between disputes, they were also leaders in crises, particularly when there was a military threat, because it was the judges who had that respect from all the tribes, so they could put together, they could bring together fighting men from all different tribes to kind of put together a militia, a fighting force that they would then often lead on the battlefield, including Deborah, by the way. She went out to fight too. So the judges were people respected by all the tribes, settled disputes, led them in crisis, in times of war. But by the time of Samuel, the last of the judges, the people were really getting scared of the Philistines. They were the big enemy now, and they were looking nastier and nastier. So people go to Samuel and they say, we want a king like all the other nations. We want a king who can draw all the tribes together, give us unity. We want to have a permanent fighting force, a regular army. We want to have a king who will always be there to take the field and win our battles. And Samuel says to the people, well, you don't understand. The reason you don't have a king is because you are a unique nation. God is your king. You are God's people. And whenever you've trusted God, he's always delivered you. If you have a human king, you won't be able to trust that king in the way that you can trust God. God is always simply there to bless you. Whereas kings, you'll find, will have their own agenda, will be after their own glory. They will take from you, your money. They will take the best you have. They will take your sons and your daughters. You won't see them again. And it will be for their own wealth. It will be for their own projects. But the people say to Samuel, no, but we want a king. Please, give us a king. So he chooses the first king, Saul, who starts well, but quickly his reign becomes a desperate struggle to hold on to power. And Saul is absolutely in a jealous fear of David, his rival. And that simply is what his reign is about. Desperately trying to exterminate David, clinging on to power for himself. It's just a sad shambles. Then when David becomes the second king, you get the feeling that, here is about the best king you're ever going to get. I mean, not only is he this great warrior king, which all the people want and need at that time, but he's somebody who's got this great sort of self-assured self-confidence, and yet he's not arrogant. He's a humble, gentle man. He's a great warrior, and yet he's got this wonderful kind of feminine side of his personality all kind of integrated. He's a singer, he's a dancer, he plays the harp and makes music, and it's beautiful. He's quite an unusual man. And he's not just a man who is a great sort of believer in God. He's got this faith, this trust in God. He's actually got a deep spirituality. He's a mystical king. If you read his psalms, they're absolutely beautiful and written straight from the soul. Very touching. So David comes to power and you think, this really is it. This is going to be great. But power seems to do things to people, doesn't it? And you can really see that as you go through these books of the Bible. David changes. By the time of the Bathsheba scandal, he is a different man altogether. You almost don't see the old David now. And the sin of Bathsheba isn't just simply that, here's a king who thinks he can just go and take anybody else's wife for himself and commit adultery and whatever. But, his then deception of Uriah to try and make Uriah believe that Bathsheba's carrying Uriah's son and not the king, not the son that David has fathered on Bathsheba. But when he fails in trying that deception, he doesn't just arrange for Uriah to be killed, but in that arrangement, many other people lose their lives as well. So, it just gets worse and worse, stacked up against David. And from this point of his reign, he just has one problem after another. And he doesn't stand head and shoulders morally above anybody now. He's a man full of bitterness to the end of his days. After David, of course, comes Solomon, and we get a new start. And again, it's very, very promising. Solomon inherits the peace and stability which David has won through all his victories. And when he's crowned, God says to Solomon, "Ask me something. What do you want?" And Solomon asks for wisdom. And God says, well, because you've asked something which is actually going to be good for the people so you can govern them wisely, I'm going to make you the wisest king ever. And I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for. You can be the wealthiest king ever. So Solomon starts this golden reign of huge peace and prosperity and wealth and riches, and he builds beautiful palaces and buildings in Jerusalem, builds the temple, central for the worship of God. And you think, finally, this is the golden age of God's people living in Jerusalem on the promised land. But Solomon, gradually, he just becomes more and more disillusioned with everything, just dry and empty. If you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it's incredibly sad and depressing reading. And it's remarkable that, Solomon, the one man who says the worst things ever about women, was completely addicted to them. This wise man who can't find any worth at all in women, marries 700 times and has 300 royal concubines. So the only good thing about being part of Solomon's harem is you'd only have to get to spend a night with him every 3 years. He's a very, very sad character. And of course he's marrying women who aren't Israelite women, but they're from the kingdoms all over the place. And they come with their gods and their religions. And Solomon embraces all this. So the last part of his reign, he built the temple, great, but now he's just building shrines and temples to every god all over the place, and himself indulging in the worship. So, the worship going on in Jerusalem and the royal court is far more pagan than anything else by this time. Of course, it's not that I want to blame foreign women. There's women like Ruth, who's a Moabite. She's a foreign woman. But of course, she marries an Israelite man and she adopts the Israelite religion. She says after her husband's death to her mother-in-law, when she says, "Go back to your people and your God," she said, "No. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried." It's beautiful, isn't it? But, it shows that it could work the other way around, You can actually marry a foreign woman who actually abandons her gods and worships the living God. But too often, it was the other thing that went on. The kingdoms fall into two after Solomon's time, under his son Rehoboam, who's a particularly stupid and nasty piece of work. Most of Israel refuses him as king. And so now you have a northern kingdom and that is called the Kingdom of Israel. And the southern kingdom, ruled by Solomon's heir Rehoboam and his descendants, which is called Judah. So you've got the Kingdom of Judah in the south, Kingdom of Israel. And on the whole, the kings get worse and worse. If you're just sort of reading the whole epic, it feels like kind of one step forward, two steps back. Perhaps the worst of all was Ahab. He was the 7th king of Israel, and he famously married Jezebel. Now, Jezebel is this incredibly powerful woman who soon has really got the kingdom in her hands and is completely controlling Ahab. Her father was the king of Tyre and Sidon, but he was also high priest of Baal, and she is a completely fanatical devotee of Baal, and so she makes it her business to eradicate the worship of Yahweh, of the God of Israel, within Israel. And you know, she almost does it. It's only Elijah who saves the day in that amazing showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And even at that time, you know, after that, when Elijah is saying to God, I think I'm the only one in Israel who has not worshipped Baal. And God says, actually, Elijah, there's been 7,000 people who haven't. Well, a quick calculation guess is that's probably about 2 or 3% of the population. So apart from 2 or 3% of the population, the whole of Israel has been busy worshipping Baal. You know, we sometimes worry about the future of the Church of England, but we've still got more than 2 or 3% of the population of this benefice regularly worshipping. So you can see how Israel really had their backs to the wall at times. Let me finish by mentioning a good king. You know, there were some. Josiah, who is the 17th king of Judah, he's doing some repair work on the temple, and they find a book that was hidden or lost, and it's one of the books of the law, book of Deuteronomy, that as Karen said last week, you know, the name literally means a fresh look at the law, or a second look at the law. And nobody's seen it for hundreds of years. And all of these laws, they've not been doing any of them. And so Josiah spends the rest of his reign doing what the reforms are to try and turn Israel back. But most of that seems to be destroying the pagan shrines and the altars that are just crept all over the place. And of course, after Josiah's time, when he's destroyed them all, they all get rebuilt again. So to the close of this period, when the prophets have been saying for some time, you know, the writing is on the wall, this is going to have to stop. They liken the people of Israel to, to one half of a marriage partnership where they've been just repeatedly committing adultery, saying, you know, the covenant with God is like a marriage. You know, we've married God and we've said we won't have anybody but you. But we have, again and again and again and again, we have gone after other gods. We have been unfaithful. We are an adulterous people. And that image is the one that occurs most often in the prophets as they try and tell Israel what it's like. And as they say, we've never kept our half of this bargain, of this covenant, and therefore we will lose this land. And eventually it happens. The northern kingdom is the first to go. It's destroyed and the people are led away to captivity. And then finally, in the year 587 BC, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes in and he destroys Jerusalem. He razes it to the ground. He burns the temple. And the hopes of God's people living lives pleasing to God in the promised land all go up in smoke. And the people are dragged away in chains into another captivity, another slavery. Is there any hope for them? Is there any hope that this amazing covenant with God is ever going to mean anything? Well, you'll have to wait and see.